Bienvenidos a la Universidad Nebrija. Welcome to Nebrija University. This keynote roundtable discussion will feature Professor Cecilia Bayet, UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, Professor Pablo Ceriani, Vice Chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families and National University of Lanús, Argentina, and Michel Levoy, Director of PICUM, for a conversation on the risk and potentialities of solidarity in the migration context. The roundtable will be moderated by Professor Diego Acosta, Director of the Nebrija Global Chair on Migration and Human Rights. They will share their views on the extent to which solidarity may work to channel rights-related struggles and to amplify rights claims by migrant communities and those who stand in solidarity with them. They will also debate whether, to the contrary, there may be limitations to the use of solidarity to support migrant rights. The speakers will rely on their vast experience and expertise in the field of migration, human rights, and solidarity. The discussion will be followed by Q&A. Welcome to Nebrija University. This keynote roundtable discussion will feature Professor Cecilia Bayet, UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, Professor Pablo Ceriani, Vice Chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families and National University of Lanús, Argentina, and Michel Levoy, Director of PICUM, for a conversation on the risk and potentialities of solidarity in the migration context. The roundtable will be moderated by Professor Diego Acosta, Director of the Nebrija Global Chair on Migration and Human Rights. They will share their views on the extent to which solidarity may work to channel rights-related struggles and to amplify rights claims by migrant communities and those who stand in solidarity with them. They will also debate whether, to the contrary, there may be limitations to the use of solidarity to support migrant rights. The speakers will rely on their vast experience and expertise in the field of migration, human rights, and solidarity. The discussion will be followed by Q&A. En breve comenzaremos. Rogamos vayan tomando asiento. Muchas gracias. Universidad Nebrija. Nosotros lo resumimos en un lema: pasión por saber y pasión por emprender. Les agradecemos apaguen o silencien sus dispositivos móviles. En breve comenzaremos. Rogamos vayan tomando asiento. Muchas gracias. Bienvenidos a la Universidad Nebrija. En breve comenzaremos. Rogamos vayan tomando asiento. Muchas gracias. Comenzamos. Les rogamos, guarden silencio.
Hola. Okay, yeah. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. I'll switch into, voy a cambiar a inglés, ¿no? Porque es el idioma del evento del día de hoy, pero bueno, es un placer recibiros a todos aquí en la Universidad de Nebrija en un evento de la Cátedra de Migraciones y Derechos Humanos. So I'll switch into English. Welcome everybody to this event that we are organizing here at the Chair on Migration and Human Rights at the University of Nebrija. This is part of a larger event that we are organizing with several universities and with several colleagues. Professor Moreno Lax from Harty, Berlin, ICREA in Barcelona, and Queen Mary in London, with Yaya Rangi-Nogales, Professor Yaya Rangi-Nogales from Temple University in Philadelphia, and with Professor Alessandra Delano from the New School in New York. And so this public event is part of a larger event where we are discussing migration and solidarity. My name is Diego Acosta. I'm a professor of migration law and European law at the University of Bristol in the UK, and I'm also the director of the Global Chair on Migration and Human Rights here at Nebrija University. So with us today we have an excellent panel, and so pleased to be welcoming the three of you to Madrid and to this event here at our chair. So I'm going to go in order in the way you're going to be presenting afterwards. The way in which we're going to deal with this is I'll ask a number of questions to each of our three speakers. They're going to answer in turn, and then we'll open up for questions or comments from the audience. So first of all, we have Cecilia Bailet, who is a professor of international law at the University of Oslo, and she is also the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights and International Solidarity. She has published extensively on a number of topics, including general public international law, human rights, refugee law, constitutional law, counterterrorism, gender women's rights, solidarity, and peace. She has contributed lectures to the UN Audiovisual Library of International Law, and she has many, many publications, but I guess for the purposes of today's event, one of the most relevant publications will be your last edited book, the Research Handbook on International Solidarity and the Law. The second speaker that we're going to have today is Pablo Ceriani Cernadas, who is the Vice Chairperson of the UN Committee of the United Nations Committee for the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families. He's also the Director of the Specialization on Migration, Asylum, and Human Rights at the National University of Lanús in Argentina. He's a Professor of Migration Policies and Human Rights in several universities in Argentina and in other countries, and he has also consulted for several international organizations, including UNICEF, the International Labour Organization, IOM, UNHCR, and many others. He also has a very close relationship with Spain, for example, having a PhD from the University of Valencia. And finally, I'd like to welcome Michel Leboy, who is the director of PICUN. PICUN is perhaps the most important NGO in Europe when it comes to, in particular, undocumented migration. So it's the platform for international cooperation on undocumented migration based in Brussels. She has led this organization for almost 2 decades, and PICUN advocates for the rights of undocumented migrants at European institutions in particular, but also more generally at global level. Michelle has played a key role as a board member for several civil society organizations at the global and EU level. She holds degrees in French, Justice and Peace Studies, and also a Master in Applied Sciences in Housing and Development. So it's a tremendous honor to welcome the three of you here at Nebrija, as I was saying earlier. And I'm going to start with a question for Cecilia. And the first question is the following. You have written extensively on the relationship between solidarity, rights, and international law. Could you tell us a bit more about how these three elements, solidarity, rights, and international law, relate with each other, and what are the synergies and the tensions that you can find there? Thank you.
Thank you to the University of Nebrija for this kind invitation. It's an honor to speak about this.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this on? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Solidarity is the universal principle of international law. It is a Kantian Grundnorm, and that means you will find it in many constitutions all over the world, including the Constitution of Spain, Article 2, where it's talking about solidarity for the autonomous regions and the nationalities within the great nation of Spain. So when you look at the iterations at the national level, they adjust to the context of the background and the history of each country. So some constitutions will address the need for development and equal development between the provinces and the capital. Others will talk about protection of women. Others will talk about the need to distribute water, to protect the environment, to protect indigenous peoples, and so on. You don't have one cookie-cutter version of solidarity. Solidarity is defined by the peoples according to their backgrounds and traditions. And so within Europe, you have it in Title IV. It's a meta-right that is addressing the need for solidarity interests like workers' rights, the environment, protection of children, etc. And the Secretary General issued a report called A Common Agenda. And there he's saying, we recognize that the world has changed, that the Westphalian state system is affected, and therefore we're going to define a new era of multilateralism that will be based on international solidarity. This means that we recognize that for the protection of international human rights, we will turn not only to the state, but we will turn to corporations, to civil society, to faith institutions, and we will recognize a common responsibility to face global challenges like climate change, inequality, terrorism, etc. Can you show the first slide, please? The normative basis for solidarity.
¿Podéis mostrar la próxima diapositiva, por favor? La tengo yo, perdona, disculpa. That's all right.
Okay. So when we turn to human rights, where does solidarity fit in? How do we know that solidarity belongs within the family of human rights? At the EU level, we see health solidarity, we see energy solidarity, we see security solidarity, so we have many norms. Why does it relate to human rights? So we go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 1, look at this. 75 years of celebration of the norms that were supposed to set the foundation for us to live in peace. And Article 1 reads, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this is a sentence that most people know because it's the basis of our liberal order. Most people don't know that there's a second sentence. So the drafters of the Declaration, they put in a second sentence that says, they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. What this means is that the drafters of the Declaration knew that we cannot possibly achieve freedom or equality and dignity if we all don't recognize that we have a horizontal obligation to enable that enjoyment. And I argue that it's the lack of attention to the second sentence that has resulted in the catastrophic levels of global inequality that we see today. So when we turn to the revised draft declaration, we decided to focus very much on the linkage of solidarity to freedom of expression and freedom of association, because we realized that civil society is the actual engine of international solidarity. But the problem is we have an actual shrinkage of civic space, and this is because of efforts to define civic society actors as being extremist or being linked to terrorist or separatist movements. And the reduction of this civic space online and in the physical space is resulting in a shrinkage of the ability of people to engage in solidarity actions. So this is the status that we're looking right now and the tensions that we're seeing.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. You have also focused on the role of, in your teaching and in your work, and you have also focused on migration and on migrants' rights. So my next question would be, what role do you see solidarity playing when it comes to the protection of migrants? Does it have any particular salience when it comes to migrants in particular? Or do you think it applies in the same way as it will apply to any other vulnerable population?
Thank you very much. Today, we discussed many different definitions and iterations of solidarity. The two that we focus on within the work at the UN is network solidarity that's defined by the Secretary General. This is looking at connections that cross borders, that engage people of different ethnicities, of nationalities, of gender and religion. It seeks to build bridges. And it's very relevant to migration because of the cross-border nature of migration. So civil society groups that help migrants, they rescue them at sea, they transport them across borders, they give them water and medicine and food and legal aid. These are all solidarity actors. But my reports also focus on the efforts of states. For example, Germany uses an AI program to match refugees with housing and jobs. And this is a type of solidarity that seeks to recognize that refugees are entitled to socioeconomic rights. But the contrast to the network solidarity, and the one that actually gets most attention today, is called unitary solidarity. And this type of solidarity is really defined by exclusionary actions that are seeking to keep people out of a different background. So you see states using border control and pushback, cooperation, solidarity actions that will seek to prevent the entry of migrants, to externalize the processing of migrants, to eliminate the regular channels of migration, and to criminalize humanitarian actors, including the faith institutions. So we consider unitary solidarity, we say that that violates human rights, and we want it challenged by lawyers, and we want it challenged by civil society because of the devastating impact that it has on migrants. So the revised draft declaration on international solidarity draft two clear standards for protection of migrants that calls for the creation of regular channels and access to justice, and also objects to the externalization of migration control. So perhaps you can show them that language. And how many women law students do we have in this audience? Do we have any students? ¿Estudiantes de derecho? ¿Mujeres? Sí. Las mujeres, por favor. Muchas gracias. ¿Quieren saber? Do you want to see? Would you like to see the woman that drafted this provision? She's sitting right behind you. And her name is Professor Jaya Ramji Nogales. I want to show you the impact of having women in international law. This is Jaya's drafting, and here she is having a standard that is calling for the elimination of externalization of migration control. You can use this article to argue against the European Asylum Pact, because there you have normative language that you can refer to. And can he show the other one? This is also drafted by Jaya. And do you see how Jaya is placing emphasis on the procedural rights? Because we see that what is being chipped away is the ability to actually counter the abuse of power by the state. So we're going to be focusing most of our efforts on procedural justice, and I'll talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps the last question refers to your role as the UN independent expert or the rapporteur on human rights and international solidarity. So what are the lessons that you have learned from your work at the UN level in the last few months or since 2023 about the practical avenues for putting solidarity to work in service of migrants' rights, and what are perhaps some of the political obstacles that you see in putting that effort into play?
Well, I'm going to return to the issue of procedural rights because when we think of the Global Compact, they didn't create any procedural mechanisms for migrants to challenge their detention or their unfair processing, or even for the refugees, because there was, frankly, no political will. So I think that the key challenge for those of us working at the international level, but also at the ground roots level, is to try and bring about a recognition of the essence of creating remedial mechanisms. Because the very notion of democratic solidarity is dependent on institutions that give procedures for people to be able to present their claims. When we're seeing the establishment of externalization and fast-track procedures that are based on nationality, this is a violation of the principle of non-discrimination. And do you know that's a jus cogens norm? I mean, it's a peremptory norm. This is something that we need to really focus on and challenge. But Jaya actually, she did another thing, not just draft a standard. Jaya wrote a chapter with Amy Chin Arroyo. It's called Forging Solidarity in the Research Handbook on International Solidarity. And there she's talking about how migrants create a culture of solidarity to fill the protection gap that is present in transit and detention countries, because you see that migrants are facing harassment and violence and extortion and sexual violence and lack of food and shelter. And the societal embrace of a culture of solidarity, it can create spaces for people to actually help those migrants in need. And there are many reports from my predecessor within the mandate where he's talking for giving voice to the migrants. So we would love for your generation to actually identify migrant influencers, if you will, to share their positive stories and show how they contribute to our society and how we need them and how we are a richer society including them within this. So these types of initiatives, I think, can really invigorate a new era of protection. But linked to this is that I'm missing a very vibrant peace movement. I see too many people fleeing because of the expansion of political violence. And I would just love for the abandonment of terms like conflict management or refugee or migrant management, where the key value is efficiency. This is not going to solve any of those root causes of migration. We need to actually call for solidarity for peace initiatives to protect migrants from violence in the country of origin or in transit and destination countries.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. So I'm going to move to ask a couple of questions to Pablo, following from what Cecilia has just been discussing, and in your role as Vice Chairperson of the Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers, and actually you have been in that committee for a number of years now. So what role do you think the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers can play as a medium for solidarity?
Yes, well, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, let me thank the university and Diego for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Well, as Cecilia said, of course, there is an intrinsic relation between solidarity and human rights. No, I mean, not only for equal protection, the whole catalog of human rights is necessarily linked to solidarity. And the committee is one of the, what we call the treaty bodies. You know, all the states since 1963. The first one have been drafting and adopting human rights, international human rights treaties within the United Nations. So for each of these treaties, the states created a body, well, that's why they call treaty bodies, the body which with a mandate to monitor how states implement these legal obligations that the states themselves created. No, it's not something that is imposed to state, it's a decision laid by state. It has been like that forever, since international human rights law have been developed. So we are, the Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers, are one of these treaty bodies. like the Committee on the Rights of the Child that monitors the Convention on the Rights of the Child, how it's being implemented. We do the same with the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families. So, by essential, I mean, our role is totally linked to everything what solidarity is stand up for. No, I mean every goal related to solidarity, any solidarity action, any solidarity network, no, is directed to achieve these core human rights treaties, no, dignity, equality, etc., etc., etc. And in our role, of course, is strictly related to the content of the convention and the goals of the convention, which is the protection of the rights of migrants. And never, I mean, although this convention was adopted 35 years ago in 1990, that's why globally we celebrate Migrants' Rights Day every 18 December. Then, I mean, apart from that, the literal content of the convention is permanently adapted to what we call a dynamic interpretation of the human rights treaties. The same happens of every law that might be some kind of outdated, and then the Court of Justice have to do some kind of dynamic interpretation. We do the same. So what we permanently do is addressing the different challenges and trends related to the protection of the rights of migrants in the current situation. And we do that through a number of mechanisms that are within our mandate, again, given by states. One is monitoring periodically reports that state that did ratify this convention have to submit to us. So then we make recommendations to state of which policies should be changed, like, for instance, decriminalize migration, decriminalize assistance to migrants, and many other recommendations that we do. But then, for us, it's absolutely critical what other stakeholders submit to us, no? Because in a way, we are a tool. We are a means. I mean, it's not. We are not a goal itself, of course. I mean, it's like a surrounding board, or it would be the word in English, like caja de resonancia, no, of what the human rights issues that's going on in different places of the world. So in this case of migrant rights, so civil society organization, academic institution, trade unions, solidarity networks, and other actors like Defensorías del Pueblo submit to us information on what's going on in this particular country. I mean, you should tell this government to change this, to address this, to protect migrants, to protect migrants' rights defenders, to grant them access to justice when they are victims of different treatment or discrimination and so on. So we permanently do recommendations based on that. Sometimes we have the challenge that our hearings are in Geneva. It's not easy, either cheap to go there. So we try to contact like root-based organizations before the hearing, before the review of a periodic report, in order to know what's going on the ground. No, I mean, what those who are working with migrants or those migrants association, I mean, in order to give them the opportunity to provide that information, because otherwise, if we do a recommendation which is not connected to what's going on in reality, what migrants actually need, the recommendation may be, I mean, not useful as they should. So one thing that we do is this periodic review and recommendations. I will maybe go back to that later on some of the limitations and challenges we are facing about that. And the second thing that we do is we develop guidelines. Again, another mandate that the states gave to treaty bodies is help us to implement this convention, help us to fulfill our legal duties. So that's something that we do. It's called general comment. These technical documents that we do, it's guidelines. That's why they are called authoritative guidelines, because it's guidelines based on our mandate, the mandate given to us, in order to, in a way, help. It's like sort of technical assistance that state actual fulfill the legal duties. No, in this case, is granting and protecting and respecting and fulfilling migrants' rights, but also their families. So maybe I can come back on that in order to elaborate more what we are doing currently on this matter, and which are, because they are totally connected to solidarity.
Okay, Thank you, Pablo. You have mentioned, obviously, that the convention is a living instrument that has to be interpreted. But obviously, the convention distinguishes between migrants in a regular situation and migrants in an irregular situation in different articles. So do you think this is an unsurmountable limit to using the convention as a vehicle for solidarity? What can you say about that?
If I only read the convention, I may say yes, but based on the work that we are doing, I would say no. The content, the literal wording of the convention is the result of almost 20 years of negotiations between states, and not everything, but most of the more restrictive articles are based on proposals made by European states, but unfortunately, after the convention was adopted, European states haven't ratified the convention. So they work a lot to put this kind of wording, but then they didn't join our club of committing to migrants' rights. Anyway, but so there is a section that provides like a whole set of rights, human rights recognized universally to everybody, to any migrant regardless of migration status. But as you said, Diego, there is another set of rights that are more connected to the regular situation. For instance, everything related to social security scheme under formal employment, or only migrants with a regular status are authorized to work. So it's linked at that. Rights related to voting, for instance, political participation in regular election. So it's also recognized only to regular migrants. But as I said, I mean, they are living instruments. There is a principle it's called to useful effect útil of human rights treaties. So based on those principles, treaties as a living instrument, we have been addressing, even regardless the title of the convention. Sometimes we end up discussing with someone, even within the UN system, saying, you only address workers. No, it's not that. It's just the title. I mean, it's mentioned in every article, but we address every single human rights issue related to people in the context of migration. And increasingly, because of these trends that are I mean, there are so many evidence that we receive increasingly on the situation, on all the risks and trends that are affecting the rights of migrants in an undocumented situation. Almost not all the agenda, but I would say that 70–80% of our agenda and the standards that we have been developing the last years is about migrants in an irregular status. For instance, as I mentioned, the provision of criminalizing irregular migration, any kind of irregularity, many standards on forbidding or restricting as maximum as possible detention due to migration status, the deprivation of liberty of a person. That's why we have been developing many standards that are clearly against the standards implemented in the European, for instance, Directive 2008 that allowed states to detain someone up to 18 months without a person that haven't ever committed any kind of crime. The same situation in the US and in many other countries where this rule of exception in regards to the rule of law to everybody in terms of our right to personal liberty have been validating, unfortunately linked to narratives and other kind of criminalized approach to irregular migration. So we have a lot of standards on that, on non-detention, the very much exception of detention, that the condition of migration detention shouldn't be related in any way to what we think about the detention in the criminal justice. The goals and the reason for depriving someone liberty is totally different, but nevertheless, we all know that most of the detention centers are not only criminal-like prisons, but in some cases, in most of the cases, I would say, the standards are even lower. They may not have family visit, they may not have a rule of law guarantees, access to free legal aid, to access possibility to appeal a detention, and many other issues. So we make a lot of recommendations of regularization as a key political tool, a key policy tool, that regularization is protection, regularization is prevention of many risks to exploitation, to marginalization, at least to inequality, and so on, and so on, and so on. Access to economic, social, and cultural rights, regardless of migration status. That's have been, again, a narrative that try to validate that because of undocumented status, you cannot access or you cannot access in equal basis to health services, to education services. And again, it's another example of how narratives have been creating exceptionality on undocumented migration. No? It's a standard we don't accept for, I know, imagine even the worst crime you can imagine. Those persons declared guilty for those crimes don't lose the right to access to healthcare service or education that the children. Why we accept that in the case of administrative issue, that is most of the cases is the result of policies. That's why we are talking increasingly about irregularization rather than illegal migration. No? It's the result of decisions or decisions that are not taken. And we increasingly talking about irregularity as an indicator of vulnerability. Vulnerability not of the person, vulnerability of the situation created by policies or decisions. So that's just few of the standards that we have been developing in order to address all the issues related to irregular or migrants in an irregular status.
Thank you, Pablo. And perhaps a last question. Obviously, you have mentioned the convention hasn't been ratified by a large number of countries. It hasn't been ratified by any EU member state, for example. What are some of the strategies that you are using in the committee to overcome some of the limits of the convention, one of them being the low ratification of the convention itself?
Well, the convention has been ratified by 60 state parties, 60 states from the UN, out of 200?
193. 193, I think we have UN member states now.
Yeah, there are less countries than
193.
Okay, but yeah, like a quarter of the states, or something like that, were ratified this convention. So it's not about the content of the convention, the limitation, it's politics. It's not a legal issue, it's just politics, the lack of ratification, but most of the countries from the global north, but also many countries from the global south. So what we have been doing, and it's, I mean, I don't know if we could call it like that, but it's a sort of solidarity among treaty bodies. What we have been doing since 1916, at that time we began a joint initiative with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified by 196 countries. No? So 136 countries are part of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but are not part of our convention, including all the EU countries. All the countries of the world except the US. This is the real case. So what we did with them, we worked together, we developed a joint general comment on the rights of children in the context of migration. So if 136 states don't want to come to us, don't worry, we will come to you. Through our colleagues, our partners, our cousin, whatever you want to call the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and we developed standards and guidelines that the states parties to the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, have to follow because of the mandate given to that committee. So in that context, this is a large document adopted in 2017. You can find those documents, and there are a lot of standards of what those states should do in order to protect children in the context of migration, including the total eradication on child migration-related detention. There's no ground for depriving, even for an hour, a child because of the migration status of the child or his or her parents. And what we are doing now, we are working with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. There are 186, again, all the EU countries included, that are party to the third convention. So we are working with them, and we are about to finish in just doing like the final editing phase. Will be done in maybe 2 months, will be published, something like that. We work with PICUM and many other stakeholders because we did a very consultative democratic process in the entire year to 2024. We did consultations with experts from organization, academia, etc. In all the regions about that. About what? We drafted a joint general comment on policies for eradicating xenophobia and its impact on the rights of migrants and other perceived as such, because many other social groups, even if they are not migrants, are being targeted by xenophobia because of their race, their skin color, their religion, etc., etc. So we developed these guidelines on how to address xenophobia in a comprehensive way. It's not just doing a campaign, migrants are good people, they are not criminals. It's not only about that, because xenophobia is much more complex. Like all the validation, the narrative that validate, for instance, that nationals should be treated in a better way than non-nationals, just because they were born in the other side of the border, even though they are part of the same community, they are part of the same society. This kind of, now it's just an example of many other narratives that have been fueling discrimination, fueling unequal treatment. So we developed these two documents, one with general guidelines on how xenophobia is, how to be addressed by an intersectional approach. So linking xenophobia and racism and the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of slavery, and xenophobia and children, xenophobia and gender, and elder, and disability, and religion, and etc. So in order to properly address the consequences of xenophobia on the rights of different social groups. And also, then there is a whole catalog on elements of policy for reducing xenophobia, indicators, information. All the sectors of the government have to intervene. Local governments have a critical role, participation, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the second document addressed how xenophobia have been fueling policies and different realities that lead to discrimination. So we develop standards to be implemented by media, media actors, digital platforms, the role of state for developing evidence and rights-based communication policy about migration, about irregular migration as a consequence rather than an act of people that want to violate the law and are dangerous. Then standards of education policies for building cohesive and inclusive societies, so working since the kindergarten and then up all the education levels in order to totally change and shift how migration is being addressed at the education level and the education space. And then there are, again, just to end, standards on how xenophobia have been misinfluencing migration control policies, externalization, detention, criminalization, persecution, criminalization of solidarity, pushbacks, and many other issues. Felipe González here addressed a lot of that in his mandate and special rapporteur on the rights of migrants. So we are addressing how wrong those narratives are and how policies should shift based on a proper narrative on all these aspects, and the same on access to social rights and access to political participation, the right to vote also as an antidote to xenophobia, recognizing migrants as citizens, as any other people that they share with the community, the duty of the state of committing to not using xenophobic narrative in this broader sense during election campaigns, and so on and so on. There are many standards, a long document, but we are trying to, we expect that these tools may serve as some kind of basic puzzle with all the pieces that are needed with a human rights and a normative framework to address xenophobia, especially in this context, where we are facing so many regressive trends. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. So now I'm going to move to Michelle, and I'm going to ask you some questions, obviously in your role as director of PICUN, of the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants for a number of years already. So what do you think is the link between migration, solidarity, and rights, and what role can solidarity play as an added value, especially when it comes to the rights of undocumented migrants or migrant workers in an irregular situation?
So thanks so much, Diego, for the invitation, and the organizers as well. I wanted to start off a little bit about how we as an organization started, because the first project that we started, so in 2001, which was actually the year that we officially started, was called the Book of Solidarity. So I knew it was just fate to come here. No, I wanted to start with that because I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a reflection of how we saw it then and also how we're seeing it now. But the reason why we started with our first EU project called the Book of Solidarity was because we started as an NGO based in Brussels. So our members were really small organizations that were working with undocumented migrants at the time, mainly in that region of Europe. So Belgium, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands. But they saw that the EU was starting to have its own common asylum and migration policy. So the EU had its own policy as of 1999. It was the Tampere Council conclusions that established that. And our members were in the region seeing this kind of EU development working with people who weren't being served by policies at the time, dealing with situations every day where they had to kind of express solidarity. And so they wanted a network that would be able to kind of advocate for undocumented at the start of the EU's policy. But they wanted to also see what was going on in their countries, but also in other countries. So we looked at 10 countries. We kind of expanded a little bit to Northern Europe and a little bit to Southern Europe as well. But also the reason why we did that project is because in 2002, so basically 3 years after the EU started its own common asylum and migration policy, it also adopted the Facilitation Directive. We have some scholars of the Facilitation Directive in the room who've done excellent reports. But it's very interesting to see how even this directive looked then and how it looks when it was revised in 2023. So in 2002, the directive, I think, was not even 2 pages. It probably had maybe 8 articles. I don't even think it filled 2 pages. And it was basically transposing the UN smuggling and trafficking protocol into EU legislation. So the directive for us was the starting point, as was the EU policy, but we were trying to see, okay, were there countries even before this EU directive that were criminalizing people for providing assistance? What was going on even before that directive was being implemented? And we did find some cases. So we have 3 volumes of that Book of Solidarity. They weren't a huge amount of cases, but there were. And they were also cases going back to the early 90s, some in the 80s as well, in all of those countries. We also looked at ethical questions. So social workers, what would they do when talking to someone who didn't have any possible resolution or regularization? How would they work with them ethically? We looked at reasons why people express solidarity. What was the motivation? And I actually found that very interesting in rereading some of these motivations. You kind of see people saying, I believe in equality of treatment, quote, no one is free until we're all free. One person was saying, first, I enjoyed it because I felt like I was being helpful. Then I started to get angry. And so you could see kind of some of these reasons. So basically, as an organization, we kind of did that first mapping, but then we had the privilege of working on this Rhizoma project. I don't know where Lena is, but with Lena's previous role in SOPS. So this was like a joint collaboration between some civil society organizations, think tanks, universities, and we looked again at solidarity. And what we did in that project was we tried to map it out. We mapped it out maybe over 6 years, but what was really interesting is we used media monitoring. So we as PICUM then, when that collaboration finished, we took that on. And that's where I wanted to bring us to the current day. So in the past 3 years, as an organization, we've continued that earlier methodology of media monitoring, and we've been counting cases of criminalization. So last year, we just counted cases from 2024. And I should say this is only media monitoring. So media monitoring means limitations. So everything's not going in the media. But what we already saw from 2024 is that 142 people were criminalized for acting in solidarity with migrants. In 2023, it was 117. In 2022, it was 102. Of the 142 people last year, 88 were for search and rescue at sea. 21 were for providing food, water, or clothing. 17 were for civil disobedience, like protests or political activism. What we've also seen with this media monitoring is that the average length of the time of the criminal cases is about 3 years. And also, in a lot of trials, they're classified as unfounded. So they lead to acquittals. So in a sense, an average time of 3 years, more or less, obviously, and a lot of it, the person is free. So what was all that for? What was all this hardship for? We also monitor non-judicial harassment that comes in the media. So what are some non-judicial harassment? surveillance of civil society activities, stops and identification of the police, failure of authorities to protect civil society from threats, closure of a laundry in a communal space, raiding a volunteer's private home. So we saw that there were cases in Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus, France, Greece, Italy, Poland of non-legal harassment. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that the backdrop for criminalization of solidarity is criminalization of migration. So there were 91 people last year who were criminalized just for crossing the border irregularly, so charged with smuggling. Many times these are children, and I know there's an organization here that has done the El Hiblu 3 case, where it was also children being targeted. And maybe just to end on this particular point, so what we're also looking at then is how is this possible by law? So it continues in the EU under the Facilitation Directive. And in November in 2023, the European Commission revised that initial directive from 2002 to try to fight smuggling better. I mean, why do you revise it? You have to have a good reason, right? So basically, it's not really tackling the root causes of smuggling, which are the lack of safe and regular routes, as we've heard, to come to the EU. So where are we now with this political negotiation? Last December, the European Council, so of member states, largely validated the initial revision by the European Commission. So the Commission and the Council are largely together. The European Parliament is now looking at its own draft report, which it has to adopt. The draft report would exempt humanitarian assistance from criminalization, but it still leaves the definition to the member states of what humanitarian assistance could be. And over years, part of this Rizoma project and work that we've been doing also with lawyers have told us it's not enough to have guidelines. We need the change in the law. We need strict definitions. Judges think guidelines are interesting, but they ultimately want guidance from the law itself. And so if you have the opportunity to revise this, get the clarity in the law. We don't have that in the initial Commission proposal. It's still being negotiated. So I would maybe leave it at that for the moment, but come in on the other side.
Thank you, Michelle. So taking into account that grim picture, I mean, that, concerning picture in many regards, although I have to say that not everything in Europe is going in that direction. Actually, in Spain, we have some interesting developments when it comes to undocumented migrants, right? And we might have some even more interesting developments to come in the coming months. But to conclude, perhaps, the panel, before I open the floor to the rest of the audience, an easy question, easy between, obviously. Can solidarity realize the promise of universality of human rights? What role can it play there?
So I do want to end on a more positive note, but I wanted to also bring in for reflection to get us to the positive note one other element, so I kind of talked a little bit about like the penalization, the court cases against solidarity, the non-penalization, but another way that we looked at it years ago, and we're still looking at it now, is what's another way of trying to silence assistance or trying to prevent assistance? And that is reporting obligations. So what are reporting obligations? It's basically laws or policies requiring public authorities and service providers, for example, healthcare professionals, teachers, social science, social service employees, education authorities, who come in contact with undocumented migrants in their daily work to report them to the police or the immigration authorities, because it's part of the legislation or it's part of the policy. And we as an organization have been long worried about this because of the existing laws and also the development in Europe. We see that reporting obligations violate human rights. We've talked a lot about the human rights framework and kind of this relationship with solidarity and human rights. There's the right to equality and non-discrimination, which we've heard about. I think interesting to recall that the Council of Europe European Commission on Racism and Intolerance, called ECRI from the Council of Europe, had a general policy recommendation in 2016, number 16, which is probably, I think, the thickest and the most authoritative we have globally on the reporting, so on the firewall. So basically this excellent reference is basically for member states of the Council of Europe and instructing them not to report undocumented migrants when they come in contact with social services or other entities' justice. But we also have the right to privacy and data protection, which is under Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the EU has, in a sense, now the strongest data protections in the world. Do they apply to undocumented migrants? Can they be? That's a question I'd like to ask here for discussion. But what I wanted to say is also, what else have we been worried about with the national level, with these reporting obligations? So just a couple of examples. The Fundamental Rights Agency in 2021 did a report where it looked at 25 EU member states, and it found that 20 of 25 had labor inspectors reporting undocumented migrants to the police, either because their laws allowed it, either because their internal documents or their practices allowed it. So the majority of EU member states were not upholding labor rights for undocumented migrants. Germany, since 1990, has had a law to report undocumented migrants to authorities. And there was a campaign by more than 80 organizations, doctors, churches, against Article 87 of the Residence Act. So basically calling on the government to change the law, to not allow people to report. There's been a complaint filed in 2021 and 2024 by a German organization to the European Commission against the GDPR law of the EU. The European Commission is still reviewing this. The first time it did not, it sent the thing back to Germany. CEDAW, the Committee on Women's Rights of the UN in 2023, in its concluding observations, urged Germany to reconsider its position because migrant women could not get access to healthcare and justice. So we know from Germany that having this reporting obligation has had a terrible effect, not just on individuals themselves, but on anyone who's involved with it. I mean, it's creating so much confusion from healthcare professionals, local authorities. So it hasn't been enough to have more than 30 years of that, but Sweden has now used Germany as a model. And Sweden is looking at its own proposal. And Sweden actually did a whole government inquiry to have a very similar reporting obligation. And that's kind of where I want to end this, is how are we going to make sense of all of this and move forward? And what we find very encouraging is kind of where is the resistance and the solidarity coming from, in addition to the first examples, which are individuals and organizations which are providing solidarity who are being criminalized, but it's also in other forms. So the Swedish example, currently the government is still looking into this proposal, but there originally were 9 governmental entities that were required to report. Now it's only 6. Obviously, none of the more than 80 organizations on that coalition wanted any entities having an obligation to report. But the 3 that were exempt, so services, health, education, were probably exempt because of these broad coalitions. And so that going forward, this is where we actually think is the way forward, and that's where we've seen the most change, is broad coalitions. So civil society, researchers, trade unions, faith-based organizations. We've had many examples, which I can come in the discussion, but where we've seen the duty to report overturned or limited, or rejected. And there, I think, is hope. The other level that I think we could also look into more and find inspiration from is the different levels of government. So city and regional levels of government, technicians. We've seen a lot of examples of like safe reporting policies, instructions to not report from that level, and also legal strategies. I think that with everything that we've heard, we know we have to continue to have these legal fights. Pablo ended on the migrant children joint general comment from 2017. We have globally now a recognition that children should never be detained for immigration purposes. We don't have that clarity in law. We need some case, but and so we don't have it because the European Commission proposal on return that I think you mentioned the 2008 directive, but the new proposal now does also not give that clarity. It continues to allow detention of children. So the last point that I would make is actually the words themselves. I think that as we continue to challenge kind of the whole migration system, I think we also have to be aware of how the actual vocabulary is part of that. And so I usually, in any place that I'm at, I'm always hearing the term illegal. Illegal entry, illegal stay, illegal migrant, illegal work. Don't hear illegal child that much, but you, thankfully. But it's so commonplace. So how do we challenge that? How do we give other vocabulary? I just use it as the last example because it's probably the easiest and the most challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So actually the convention talks about irregular migration, right? Or migrants in an irregular situation, right? So who would like to start with comments or questions? There's one here. I think I need help with the microphone, yeah. Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If you could please introduce yourself and then, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am Fenelon Johnny from the University Thomas Sankara from Haiti. I want to thank the university for this event, special event of today, and especially the 4 teachers from Mr. Acosta to Mr. Pablo, but I don't forget you, teacher Michelle and Professor Cecilia. In fact, the world, the human health is a big family living in Earth, about several countries. Every country has specific reality. Does international solidarity has only one process, a specific process according to each country to know the needs of each country to bring them solidarities. And this question, I think it is for Professor Cecilia. You have just said that we have just celebrated the 75 years of international solidarity. I know that international solidarity has gold, expectation or hope. Does the expectation always between these 75 years, they have become reality? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to, is there any other questions, comments? Felipe, here.
Thank you, Diego. Felipe González Morales, former UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Well, congratulations for this event and for the panelists. I think it has been an excellent set of presentations. I wanted to make a point first about one question raised by Michelle regarding the issue of firewalls and the right to privacy. Because I remember when I was doing research on firewalls, I met with a number of, NGOs and other organizations from many countries, but in the case of Spain, remember the NGOs from Spain stressed to me that this was not an issue, this is not an issue here, due to the protection of the right to privacy. So it is an example of a situation in which there isn't a specific, an explicit rule regarding migrants, but it's the application of a more general rule for the protection of privacy that will also ban the public services functionaries to share the information with the enforcement agencies regarding migrants. And on the issue of the scope of the work of the Committee of Migrant Workers and the fact that the convention has been ratified by 60 states only, I remember that there was an initiative by the committee to make a general comment about the relationship between the convention and the Global Compact on Migration. And the Global Compact on Migration has been signed by near 160 countries, so I think that could be another avenue, and I would like to hear if that is still an ongoing initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Sebastián, here at the...
Thank you for this insightful presentation. And many thanks for... Oh, this. Well, sorry. The note. Many food for thought. This question is addressed to all, but especially to Pablo, if I may. I often reflect on the language we use in human rights discourse, especially phrases like eradicate xenophobia. While I understand and support the urgency behind this goal, xenophobia, like many other fear or prejudice, can be deeply rooted in human psychology and social conditioning. Could you elaborate more on how, in practice, UN committees, for instance, or related bodies, ensure the effectiveness of such aims, especially how do we move beyond aspirational language to tangible or substantive aims or impact on this ground?
Thank you, Sebastián. So, Lucia.
Well, thank you to all the speakers. My name is Lucia. I'm a consultant on migration governance and migrants' rights issues. Your presentations were very interesting because we are claiming for international solidarity in an era where individualism seems to be increasing a lot, you know. So I wanted to ask the three of you, in your different roles, how can we, through international solidarity, fight these mainstream discourses that we are challenging right now, of where migrants seem to be the foreign offenders or the danger or the other that we need to fight, you know, among our societies. So how can we, what are the strategies to fight all these discourses, knowing that in the media this discourse is spread so easily, but in the other side we have the negotiations of international treaties that go so slowly. So which strategies do you think we can find?
Thank you, Lucia. So I'm going to leave it, we can take a second round later, but I'll give, perhaps in the opposite order, right? So I'll give the floor first to Michelle, and then Pablo, and then Cecilia, and then we can have another round of comments and questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Felipe, for noting about Spain. Actually, I was going to give that example because we've also seen with the empadronamiento system here in Spain that it's the only country in Europe where undocumented can safely go to the town hall and register in order to get access to service. And to our recollection, there was only one time, and I think I mentioned that to you, Pablo, once, to try to see, or maybe you remember, Diego, I think maybe 2005, 2006, where the national level government proposed to eradicate the firewall. So basically proposed that the local authorities would report. And at the time, it was hugely resisted by the city authorities. So it was interesting to also see it's firmly anchored in Spain. It has been challenged. Who has challenged it? But what also can Spain give as an example to other countries? It's existed, this possibility, for decades. Obviously, it's not perfect. It's not easy for everyone who's undocumented to register, but it is a very good example that's usually when we give this example, even within our own civil society network, others in other places of Europe who work with undocumented are surprised. There's a lack of awareness. So I think it's excellent to actually understand how it works better in Spain and also look at it for other countries. I also thought, Sebastian, your comment was really interesting. I'll let Pablo ponder that a little bit, but I actually find very interesting the word eradicate because of detention of children, because we do have a global agreement to eradicate it from the human rights bodies, but that itself was not a given. So 10 years before, like how long did it take to get that joint general comment from the Migrant Workers Committee and the Convention on the Rights of the Child? It took some time. We have it. So we have this agreement, but we do not have any translation of it in practice. So to give you an example, the European Commission, March 11th, I think, of this year, proposal to revise the Return Directive. In the opening part, talks about the directive the regulation, being informed by the best interests of the child. That should be paramount in applying this new regulation. And the directive goes on to allow detention of children. So that joint general comment said 6 years ago, let's not ever detain children because it's never in their best interests. It's always a child rights violation. And 2/3 of EU member states adopted the Global Compact on Migration, where it talks about working to end detention of children. So to me, your question is at the heart of this. How do we move from the agreement of the standards to now the practice and the policy measures? And I think then Lucia's question, what do we need to do to get there? Basically, what are you suggesting for us to do? So I think it's really important to also continuously hear from individuals themselves of how they see the situation and to hear undocumented migrants themselves. What do they think is important? What are they asking for? How are they trying to mobilize in regularization? I think the new regularization in Spain is a really great example of how civil society is also mobilizing. But how do we also challenge this in the media? Because the media is also very dominant. We as PICUM have noted ourselves that when we do get coverage, it's usually for the issues around borders. It's not as much for the other issues that we work on, some of it on healthcare, but what about the more positive stories? So I think that's something that we collectively also have to look at, is how can we also work to challenge even how the media itself, what is it choosing to show, and how can we help in maybe trying to shift that balance?
Thank you, Michelle. Pablo?
Well, thanks for the questions. Maybe just one word on firewalls, and using an example that I always use. Why many public services are obliged to report migrants that lack some paper, no, which is an administrative irregular situation that mainly affect those persons rather than others. No, it's an administrative irregularity that doesn't make any harm. So why they have to report them? And for instance, health service is not obliged to report someone that is being chased by the International Criminal Court because of war crime, which is fine because it's a health place. No, it's a place for ensuring not only a critical right, but for achieving public health policies. That's fine, but why? Only they have to report only those persons that are in a very vulnerable situation. How can we get that far? Anyway, actually, the formal law in Argentina established again that all the public services have to report migrants. That formal law was adopted by our military dictatorship. But then we see it in democratic countries, no, and when we talk the region of rights, and so how can we go that far? It's something that we have to discuss. The General Comment 6 was adopted a few months ago. It's the relation between the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and the Global Compact on Safe, Regular, or Orderly Migration. So it's already done, it's published. And one of the goals there is like, okay, again, I mean, of course, this Global Compact is not a binding instrument, it's not a legal binding instrument, but because of this political context, many states are reluctant to ratify this convention, as I said, so that's why we are approaching through the convention, our committees, trying to say, I mean, migrants' rights are covered in all the convention. It's not that only ours. I mean, this kind of social focus kind of treaties are only highlighting that the universality is not achieved. So we have to do more for children, for women, for persons with disability, for migrants. But because of the political context, it's not working. So the Global Compact is a non-binding, unfortunately, so, but the states are more focusing on that and working on that. So we are telling them, every time that you read a paragraph on the Global Compact that talks about migrants' rights, well, this document doesn't create standards because you state told everybody, and this is in the law schools, that the standards are developed only by those bodies which, with a mandate given by you states to develop standards, no? Like Inter-American Commission, the European Court of Human Rights, the committees at the UN level, the African Court of Human Rights, and so on. No more than that. So it's not that states can meet in Marrakesh, adopt a declaration or a pact, and say, okay, now the standards are we allow detaining children. No, it's not like that. I mean, you decided which are the bodies that are the only ones that are able to do that. So what we are trying to do in that General Comment 6 is telling states, okay, you are working on the Global Compact, which there are a lot of similarities with the convention, there are differences, but in any case that you try to implement the Global Compact and it's related to protect any human rights, you have to go to the standard developed by each of the competent bodies. Committee on the Rights of the Child, Committee on Migrants, on Women, etc., etc. It's not that you can create new standards. You have to go there. And then, so even if it's not binding, I mean, you still have to go to the binding framework that you created. So we try to do something like that with that General Comment 6. And on this initiative on xenophobia with the third and the idea of eradication and difficulties that we must face, of course, it's a very complex phenomenon. No? I mean, it's everywhere. It's in any social environment and political environment. That's what we try to develop. I mean, is some kind of, I mean, just a roadmap. It's just a puzzle, as complete as possible. So that's why I was saying, okay, it's not just a campaign. Okay, stop scapegoating migrants and don't, eliminate hate speech and things like that. It's like is something that is in every single aspect of society, and so we have to address that with a sort of holistic approach. So every single sector of a government, at different level of government, local, mid-governments, national governments have to be involved with that. Then, and this is also linked with the third question, the one by Lucia, and you had to bring the non-usual suspect to the conversation, because we always end up, because of this bias in our approach to migration, we end up discussing with the Minister of Interior about health. Why we are discussing with them about that? Why the health minister is not there here? We are discussing about those workers that are in an irregular status, again with the Minister of Interior or the Minister of National Security. Why? This is about work. It's about employment, and we have a lot of laws and tools for addressing how the challenges in the employment field. So if that person is in irregularity, well, you give a residence permit, give him or her a residence permit, because it's not about migration. This is about how some members of the community are exploited or are in an unequal discriminatory condition because you are not authorizing that person to work. The same with education, the same happens with health. So it's bringing those people to the conversation, because then we talk about what we want to talk, what we need to talk. In most of the society, migration has been shaping and increasing the diversity of our societies, but many of them are in undocumented status. The solution is not the migration solution, it's discussing what we are discussing about social inclusion, improving education goals, improving health protection, etc., etc. No? So this puzzle is directed to address all these actors, all these spaces. We are doing recommendations to that. And then we are aware that it's not magic. I mean, it's a long process. It will take decades to achieve some of these goals. Some of them can be more immediately, when we address about, yes, reform this in order to grant victims of racism, xenophobia, access to justice and to reparation, etc. And eliminate detention and so on. It may be easier, but then addressing this kind of social, what is said, like more depth issues, more deep issues. I mean, it's building societies. That's why we are saying, okay, education, you have to change everything. How the community is composed nowadays. The other day I was reading that it was a podcast of 70 years of immigration in France. Still, when you say who is French, maybe you will receive the same reply than 70 years ago. It is white guy, Gerard Depardieu kind of, but it's not Mohammed, 3 generations or 4 generations of French people working there, part of the society. It's still that person is not being seen as part of the society in equal basis. And it's 3 generations, 4 generations. And in the Americas we say, our father came from Spain, our grandfather came from Italy. And there's no discussion about that. The discussion is how we treat other migrants coming from the region or from Africa. That's the problem, racism in our region. But then in France or in other European countries, those who belong, who are from there, are still being seen with some kind of lens that doesn't work. So how we shape that? From school, working at the communication field, at the community level, when we can work and develop a new narrative with that people, it's part of us. In my opinion, it's not more about talking about others. There's no others. We are all part of the community where we live. But because of the way that the idea of citizenship is being built again still in many countries of nationality, we have this weird situation where many people, millions of people that live and work in Italy are considered others and being treated very unequally. And then we have hundreds of thousands of Italians in Argentina because of the grandparent came from Italy 150 years ago. Those hundreds of thousands of people in Argentina are Italians and never, ever were in Italy. Not even one day. And they participate, they elect the prime minister, the president, they participate. But those people who are there, living there, coming from Africa, from other countries, are not being part. So we have to reshape everything. And we can only do that with all the tools, all the pieces together. In some cases, goals will be achieved sooner than others, but everything has to be reframed. And then alliances and solidarity is the critical tool for doing that.
Thank you, Pablo. Cecilia. ¿Podemos poner el mapa? Perdonad. El mapa que teníamos en la diapositiva. Yeah, this one? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I really appreciate it. To clarify, we celebrate 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I showed you Article 1 to sort of show you that we have achieved very much, but we have a long way to go, and the reason why is because human rights is in constant evolution. So there are communitarian rights that are very much part of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They are the rights to peace, the right to development, the right to a healthy environment, and the right to solidarity. And these rights, right now, it's our turn. I can't emphasize this enough, that we don't have freedom and equality because we didn't understand that we have to act in solidarity in order to have freedom. So my mandate is celebrating the 20th anniversary, and we will have an event in the Human Rights Council in which we will call for engagement by states. We're hoping that states will come and confirm the value of the mandate, because there's a crisis within the United Nations. So they're seeking to cut mandates. And you can imagine that there are certain states that are not interested in the evolution of human rights and don't understand humanitarian approaches to human rights protection. So we're hoping to be able to muddle through with this. But to your question, what have we attained? What have we gained, and how is this working? Solidarity is everywhere, and it's invisible. Because you will see in many societies, people will be acting to help each other and nobody will be reporting. It doesn't make the news. Nobody cares about acts of kindness. But we know in Latin America and Africa and Asia, we know that solidarity built our communities and it's our strength. So I created the International Solidarity Map, and what happens here is that we invite all actors, be it NGOs, academics, civil society groups, whoever wants to show off the solidarity work and show that the world is not dominated by narratives of violence and polarization and fragmentation, to fight back by taking the space that is being denied to us. If the media is not interested in us, we have to go and take the spaces ourselves. So I invite everybody in the audience, to participate and put as many lines as possible, showing that we are connected, that there is a future that seeks to aspire to provide equality and non-discrimination to all people. And I am very, very optimistic, actually, because every time I go into my class to teach, I see students rushing to say, how can we help? How can we participate in this project? Because they are tired of being bombarded by messages of violence. They don't want that vision of the world to be presented to them. They want to engage in something that gives them a sense of purpose. So I firmly think that international solidarity has been functional in all of our societies, but it's never received the recognition. And I need all of your help to have it present and to receive the support it deserves, because I think that the next age, we have a choice. We can either go towards more violence and division, or we can choose to give our children a chance for peace and a youth a sense of purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'll do a second round of questions. We have around 15, 20 minutes. I'll start with Violeta here. El micrófono, por favor. O si no. ¿Tienes ahí? No, Violeta por aquí, primero. Luego pasamos ahí, sí.
Okay, thank you. This is a very spontaneous question that I've been invited to put to the whole panel. I was wondering, in a world of rising authoritarianism from Trump in the US to von der Leyen's reforms in the European Union that Michelle has been speaking to, is it productive to single out migrants and their rights? Or is there a risk that these might backfire? I mean, is there any risk that by attracting attention to migrant rights specifically as a discursive tool and as a legal strategy, we might see a backlash in the form of a misunderstanding that migrant rights are somehow not human rights, are a subcategory, a suboptimal version of human rights that have nothing to do with the real thing, and thereby inadvertently contribute to the hostility and contribute to the exclusionary bias that we see in current policies, and thereby undermine universality.
Thank you, Violeta. We have another question here, another two at the back. So first here and then two at the back. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you to the University for this event. So, and I want to say thank you to the panelists for the scholarly presentations, because talking about migration has never been easy. So my question is to the whole panel. What do you think of this statement by teacher Bertrand Badi, who thinks that migration is the future of the world?
Thank you. We have two more questions at the back. If you could pass the microphone to the back, towards the back, so we have two questions there.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Pedro. I'm an associate lecturer here at Nebrija. My question, and if it could be addressed quickly because I have an exam, that would be great. I just wanted to ask, in Spain there are some initiatives like the Aita Mari that you might be familiar with. It's a Basque ship, like a rescue ship, that sails in the Mediterranean, to save like immigrants that are like in very precarious conditions navigating. And I would like to know, since they have a huge lack of funds They cannot even sail all the year long. I would like to know what kind of relation does the EU, or especially UN, have to these NGOs that actually do the practical work in the sea. So I would appreciate, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And besides you, I think there's another question.
So hello, my name is Sofia Muchacho. I'm an international student here at Nebrija. And I'd like to first thank you all, the speakers and the panel in the university, for organizing this interesting speech or panel. And my question is mostly directed to Professor Pablo, but the more the merrier. So right now, I think it's safe to say that we are in an age where countries and more people are wanting to regularize migration more. So we're in an age where we have Poland that is totally closing their borders to immigrants. We have Italy with Giorgia Meloni, and not to mention Donald Trump. So do you think that attacking the problem of xenophobia right now, as of 2025, is more difficult than it was maybe 10 years ago?
Thank you very much. So I'll start this time with you, Cecilia. Is that okay? You guys have around 3-4 minutes to answer, if that is okay, before we close the conference. Thank you.
Okay, so Violeta, that's such a profound question, because right before coming here, I had a web meeting with women's rights groups, and they were absolutely worried that the backlash against women was in part due to the engagement of women's groups addressing women's rights in the United States. So all I can say is that what I see about the authoritarian right-wing evangelical movement that has just taken over the world is that they are united, they are effective, they have an incredibly strong network. So in my opinion, I think we need to network very, very strongly and link together in order to not let any of the chains be broken, because they want us disconnected. And right now it's all hands on deck because we are all being marginalized. So I would argue to go in that direction. And then the future, migration is the future. Yes, it's the history of the world. That's why I talk about temporal fluidity, because migration is the past, it's the present, and the future. You can't study the history of the world without tracing the movement of peoples. They say we all came from Africa, right? So this is something that there's not one person in this room that doesn't have someone in their family who has crossed a border at some point in their family history. And that is the beauty, the diversity of the human experience. So I'm all for migration as a future and anything to assist that.
Thank you, Cecilia. Pablo?
Okay, thanks. I totally agree with you. I mean, we end up many times discussing, okay, it would be great, or it would be even dangerous to highlight a particular issue and bring attention to the media, but what about having a reaction against what we try to highlight, to put in the center of the agenda? Maybe the reaction will be even much worse to what we are trying to highlight or to complain about. So I think that those who are working on civil society organizations, have this kind of discussion. I would say that it will depend on the situation, of course, because if you think that there are a lot of indicators that what you will do, advocacy strategy, and that will definitely harm people that is already in a very vulnerable situation, well, I don't know. I think it's critical to discuss with them, to work with them. Non-alliances with Migrants Association is critical when you are working on advocacy strategies or the kind of claim before judicial authorities or other authorities. It's something that you have to consider, because that's a reality, especially nowadays. You may reflect and put people, and even more risk. So, it's challenging, definitely challenging. So that's why holistic strategies and broad alliances are critical also for addressing that increasing challenge. Migration is the future, yeah, definitely. I mean, migration is a structural component of the society as we consider nowadays. I mean, it has been there for centuries because you cannot talk about mobility or immobility in the context of capitalism. I mean, it's always been like that, but then the way that mobility is now is also related to the phase of capitalism, no? I mean, precarity in neoliberal times. So, but again, it's the kind of structural work that especially those states with more capacity or with more power have been shaping. No, I mean, the exploitation of natural resources and the structural causes of every armed conflict, even in Democratic Republic of Congo, not only in Ukraine or in Syria. I mean, just name it, and you will find a lot of structural issues related to the circulation of wealth or not circulation of wealth, or how unequal is the distribution of wealth in the way we live. But at the same time, those countries that are more that the authorities or the media don't want migrants to come. I mean, I'm also behind many structural factors, not only in terms of distribution of wealth, but also attracting migrants. I mean, through this is the way we live. I mean, this is a way much better way of living than what you are facing in your country, in your village, etc. So, I mean, communication, transport. There are so many structural reforms that are invited to apart from the structural unequal conditions of living in every part of the world, are all the time inviting migrants, but are pushing for more migration. But at the same time, I mean, then you see the policies that are not necessarily directed to stop migration. It's more like reproducing inequality and hierarchization of societies of the countries where they live. So the way, as Cecilia was saying, the way we face this, the tools we will use will leave us not to more or less migration. It's what kind of cohesive or violent society we will live in a few decades. I mean, we address only a few issues related to rescue and the situation on international waters because of what we said. Many countries, like the European ones, are not directly connected to us, but we do that when we assess the situation, for instance, in Morocco, in Libya, in Syria, in Turkey, in Mexico, some Caribbean countries where the rights of those people trying to cross to other countries are permanently, increasingly affected with this externalization and criminalization that move ships, move armed forces, but they don't move rights and due process guarantees. So it's a sort of non-law or limbo spaces, and that's where civil society organizations become more and more critical, no, in order to protect people that from dying and disappearing in international water. What we do is recommendations to states in order to protect, and not only protect, but also strengthen the role that are being played by those organizations, and then of course protect them for any kind of criminalization and etc. But it's definitely it's not enough. And well, Sofia cannot agree more. I mean, this currently is I don't know. I mean, I said in the morning discussion we are having. I mean, I'm thinking more and more and more every day. I mean, we have been working on this 25 years, and now for me it's like reading Sherman in the 30s, and it's sad and very worrying. We have to keep on working. Yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. Michelle, to conclude.
Pedro, I think you said you had to go for an exam. I don't know if he actually did leave. I was actually just going to say that it's interesting when you look at a lot of those ships because they're run by donations and because they don't have any other form of income. So who is donating? The general public, mostly. So that also shows how many people of the general public have ran entire rescue ships through their donations. That's also narratives. And how can we also refer to this in our solidarity discussions in terms of challenging? Obviously, it's challenging to run a big rescue effort on donations. You know, it should be easier to do it, but it is something that is happening. So Also with the challenges to solidarity, we didn't necessarily talk about funding, but a lot of the funding is also being challenged. So it's maybe something to bear in mind, and I also think the second point on his question of what can the EU and the UN do concerning this practical work is not prevented. The EU should not prevent that practical work. It could give clarity to it. It could give legal clarity. So there's a lot that could be done on the EU level to help facilitate that. But then the last point that I would say is, in your question, it's one that we as a network have been asking since we started, because we're working on an issue that has from the start been politicized. So when we did this book of Solidarity, some of the members in countries where Germany or Scandinavia were asking, should we be so open? Will this be risky? But the strategy that we've always had is to, on the one hand, look at migration policy. What can we analyze and change with migration policy? But the other has always been what Pablo was saying, what are all the other policy areas? Because undocumented migrants' daily lives are not governed just by migration policy. They're governed by health policy, by justice policy, by gender equality, by anti-racism. So I would say that now in 2025, kind of with a combination of efforts, both on the national level in countries, but also in the EU, we have more references across other policy areas, which show this inconsistency. So a lot of the new proposals, for example, in the return regulation are inconsistent with the EU's own anti-racism action plan, with the gender equality strand, with the DG Justice recommendations on the Victims of Crime Directive concerning undocumented victims of crime. All of that is contradicted by DG Home's proposals on the return regulation. So we have an increasing body of evidence that shows this inconsistency. Now, how can we apply that? But at least we're having the evidence that shows it. So I would say that that's, and our members also say they see the hope and the solidarity in going beyond kind of individual sectors, but looking beyond and looking at workers and healthcare, et cetera.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank the three of you for an excellent panel. I'd also like to thank Nieves, who is the coordinator of the chair on migration and human rights, and Jessica and the colleagues in the audiovisual services for all their help in organizing not only this panel, but the entire event that we are running across 2 days. And I would like to thank all of you also for coming, our students and our colleagues from other universities and others in the audience, also coming from NGOs and other institutions. So with that, with those concluding words, I'd like to thank the three of you in particular. Well, we can continue the discussion if you like outside on a bilateral basis. Thank you very much.